Welcome everyone to Live with CXPA. I am Gabe Smith, CCXP. I am the content manager for the Customer Experience Professionals Association. I'm so excited for our program and our guest today because we're going to be discussing a topic that I think is so critical for CX success and for CX professionals today, and that is building and sustaining a customer-centric culture. So if you are asking yourself, how do I cultivate a customer-centric culture in my organization? How do I engage the hearts and minds of those in different roles across my organization and drive that change? And then how do I sustain that change over time? You've come to the right place because we've got a special guest today, and that is Daniel Ord, CCXP. Daniel led a customer-centric culture transformation in a major telecoms company, doing over 60 workshops over a 2-year period. So we're so excited to hear from Daniel. But before I bring him in today, I always like to hear from you. Where are you joining us from today? Go ahead and let us know in the comments. Let us know where you are. Would love to hear from you and throughout the broadcast because this, what I love about Live with CXPA, we thrive on questions. We love taking your questions live, love answering your questions. That's how we all learn and grow. So would love to hear from you. And I'm going to introduce our guest, Mr. Daniel Ord, CCXP. Daniel is the founder and director of OmniTouch International, where he has spent the last 20 years helping and inspiring people to deliver great customer and employee experience. Daniel and his team offer more than 25 industry-leading workshops, including CX management, CCXP certification prep, contact center management, quality assurance, employee experience, customer service across channels, coaching, people management, leadership, culture. You cover the breadth of the customer ecosystem, Daniel. I don't know when you sleep.
Well, that's what 20 years does for you, Gabe. So yeah, it didn't all happen straight away, but boy, it sounds impressive the way you read it. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Daniel, so happy to have you with us. And I just want to take a second to call out some of the global engagement that we're having. We've got Tina joining us from Michigan. Vanessa's joining us from Paris. We have Aderonke from Nigeria. Vivian from Nigeria. We have Thabo from South Africa. We have Silicon Valley represented, Mumbai, the Netherlands, Kenya, Italy, Panama. Love seeing the global engagement this morning, Daniel.
And I do as well. So welcome, everyone. We obviously appreciate that you're here.
Yeah. So Daniel, I kind of gave a rundown of your career, but I'd love for you to dive a little bit deeper. Tell the viewers a little bit more about you and your career trajectory up until this point.
Sure, Gabe, and I appreciate the question. As you know, my background is in finance. So my first job out of school, I was the head of accounting at the J. Paul Getty Museum in Malibu, which was quite an experience. I ended up becoming VP of Finance for a big call center operation based in Los Angeles and really enjoyed that, but still in finance. And essentially what happened is the VP of Operations who had set up the center and was running it, she resigned and took another position. So about 2 hours later, the CEO called me and said, Dan, would you like the VP of Operations job? So I literally moved from VP of Finance to VP of Operations with zero operations experience. But as I look back, I think that they felt comfortable with me because I knew the numbers. And I know numbers is always a big topic. It's not our topic for today, but I knew cost per order. I knew profit and loss. I knew all that kind of stuff. I have a feeling that they figured that I would figure out the people stuff and the customer stuff later on. So that was really an amazing entry into the world of customers. And so for 10 years, I worked running large call centers in the US and also in Asia. In '98, I moved to Singapore, where I lived for 20 years, did some consulting. Asia was definitely booming in the contact center industry. And then in 2001, which is 20 years ago, it's hard to believe, I set up my own company and basically do the kinds of things you described earlier. So I think right now it's just life is really good. In the old days, we'd be traveling, teaching people contact centers, customer service, and CX. Now, honestly, it's what time zone am I on, and everything is digital. So
yeah.
All good. Thanks for asking.
No, absolutely. So I'm excited to dive into this topic. And we were talking about the things that we could discuss, and you'd mentioned that you did this massive culture-focused engagement running 60 workshops over a 2-year period, I thought, my goodness, there are probably some lessons to learn. But before we get into that, you give us some context around that particular engagement. Why did your client feel it necessary to embark on a pretty significant culture change effort? What were their overall objectives?
I think that's a really fair question. It's an Asia-based telecom, and in Asia, telecoms tends to be quite saturated and very, very competitive. So what the leadership had done is they sat down and they said, well, what's made us successful up to this point is not going to get us to be successful in the future. The world's changed. So what the leadership team did was they actually sat down and they relooked at themselves and they engineered a new vision and a new set of values. Now, we weren't involved in that part. They did that internally. But they decided that they wanted to socialize those values and that vision across every employee of the company, and they wanted to do it with an in-person workshop. This is obviously all pre-pandemic. And they had a couple other points. One was they wanted to choose someone from outside the company because they said, if we're going to be talking about what's happening in the world of customers, we want to hear stories from other companies, from the public sector, the private sector, other countries, and other regions. So I thought that was really, really interesting that they wanted to go to the outside world. And Gabe, I think there are already 3 lessons here. If we're tabulating lessons for a talk like this, and maybe because I'm a trainer, I always end up doing that, which is probably annoying. But the first lesson I'll say that I picked up from them, and they're amazing, is they decided to go through a culture transformation when things were still good. At no point in the process did they go to their people and say, things are bad, we're doing badly, you're bad. It wasn't that. It's things are good and we want them to continue to be good. So I think that was the first lesson. I think the second lesson was they were willing to integrate external and internal voices. Obviously, they had other initiatives going on internally run by their own company people. But bringing in someone externally to run these workshops, not everybody is open to that. So I found them remarkably open to that. And I think the third lesson for this section for me was, it sounds a little bit like what's happening in the US with the politics, but go big. They went big. They said, we're not going to scrimp on this. At no point in the conversation did they say, oh, do we only put 20 people in the workshop? Can't we cram 100? Or, oh, 8 hours is a long time. Can't we make it 4? Those conversations never happened. The questions were always, what can we do to make this day with these people as impactful as possible? So I have to admit, it was a beautiful situation for a person like me.
Yeah, so I love that they had these values, this vision that they wanted to impart, and that there was no fear to make the necessary investments needed to drive the culture that needed to happen. So, what was your thought process? How did you design, these workshops? Because cross company, different roles, a lot of moving pieces. How did you design your workshops to try to achieve this customer centric vision?
It's a fair question. I think the first thing we decided as a group, and keeping in mind this was a very collaborative process with the client, was we wanted every employee to have a chance to have a voice. So the first way we handled that was by ensuring we never had more than 30 people in a workshop. The average size was 20 to 30 people, which is why there were 60 plus workshops and it took so long to do. And we came up with 2 versions, Gabe. We came up with one version for the frontline employees. And as most people in this conversation know, frontline employees are those people that tend to come in contact with customers. So the retail shop people, the call center people, the social media people. There was one workshop designed just for them, and those were the folks that were invited to what we call frontline sessions. Then there was a second workshop that was designed for obviously the backline people. So we had marketing people, we had engineers, we had IT people, we had lawyers, we had procurement people, and so on. The content of the 2 workshops was 80% the same. It's not that the 2 workshops were remarkably different, but it turned out this segmentation really worked for us. We were able to pick up quite a few things by segmenting this way. And I've got 3. Again, don't ask me why 3. Maybe it's a magic number, but I thought it might help people to hear. The first was, this being a telecoms, they had a big customer service function. And like any big company with a big customer service function, people were distributed across multiple touch points and in different geographical areas. So simply by bringing these people together under one roof, there was a tremendous amount of bonding that happened amongst the customer service team. So the social media people could talk to the retail shop people. The retail shop people could talk to the call center people. That was quite remarkable to see the bonding. The second thing is they actually solved quite a lot of problems. Now, that wasn't the purpose of the workshop to solve problems, but they actually used some of the time to solve problems. So that was one learning from separating the workshops. Another point that came up in the discussion was, well, if we don't put frontline people in with the backline people, how will we get the backline people to have empathy for what the customer service people go through? But that actually worked out really well. What we did is we curated some digital calls from the call center, as you should, and we curated some transcripts from the email team, and we actually played some of these calls. Now, we played them for the frontline, but they were already quite used to them. But when we played them for the backline, I have to tell you, there was some remarkable eye-opening, really? Is that what a real customer sounds like? So as great as this company is and as forward-thinking as they are, you still are going to have marketing people, lawyers, procurement people, engineers, IT people that have never actually heard a customer speak. So that was so powerful. And one more thing, Gabe, and then I'll be quiet here, is we're going to talk in this particular session about barriers. One of the things we did was ask people what was going to hold you back from delivering on culture. And we found that analyzing the barriers from the frontline folks across all of them, hundreds and hundreds of people, and then analyzing the barriers across the backline folks, hundreds and hundreds of people, we were able to really dig into what was going to hold people back. So that segmentation, I won't say it's an issue of right or wrong. There are pros and cons to segmenting a group like that. But I think overall, breaking it into the front line versus the back line really paid off for us. It really worked.
That's cool. And I want to ask the audience too, because I know that people who are listening in are struggling through their own culture change initiative. They're either trying to get the investment and the buy-in that you thankfully were able to sort of start with, or they're in the midst of it and they're trying to figure out, how to build this, how to sustain it. So talk about starting, getting this thing off the ground. Any lessons that you learned early on that you want to share with the viewers?
Well, in terms of getting it off the ground at this organization, I will say it was fortunate that this organization was always customer service oriented. I think they realized, like a lot of organizations do, I'm not picking out anything we all don't know, that customer service is truly a department within the organization. So while we're quite proud of our stellar customer service, we're not going to get that far if we don't begin to address all the other departments and so forth. So I will say they already at a leadership level had a strong sense of, we don't want to rest too much on just our customer service laurels. We're going to have to take, for this group, more of a customer experience ecosystem approach. Looking at this. So honestly, I don't think they had that much difficulty in putting this together and getting it approved. I think they saw the power in it. And obviously over 2 years, we can talk about some of the impacts further on, but they saw the impacts of what was happening. So it was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because after 4 or 5 sessions ran and the feedback was so outstanding, it was much easier. The word started to spread, which is, oh, you're going to love this session. You have to go to this session. Oh, it's going to be an eye opener. Your mind's going to be blown. So you get a bit of internal PR, which
that's fantastic. That positive word of mouth. I was fascinated because you mentioned that your folks that you were training had these discovery moments where they started facilitating dialogue amongst themselves. Was that something that you had planned for and baked in time for that, into the training curriculum, or is that sort of like an aha that you recognized that was happening, allowed for it, and then built time in later on for that?
Gabe, first off, you might want to consider a professional career in this, because you are really good. I don't know how you just read my mind on this stuff. Okay, so here we go. I think when you go into something like cultural transformation, you have to go in with a great deal of practicality and pragmatism. I worry sometimes people get a little bit too slogan oriented and lose the practicality. And there's a phrase I've always liked. I can't take credit for it, but here's how we approach the thinking. Organizations don't change, people do. Organizations don't change, people do. I actually said this in the session. So the point being here that we had to speak to individuals, not just to groups of people. So I'm going to put aside the word training because we really didn't see this as a training session. It was really facilitation. That's why I liked your question. I only owned the first half hour of the day. So maybe after doing the introduction, so we had a little icebreaker and all that, I owned half an hour, meaning I had the stage, I had the soapbox. And here's what I did. I went through each one of the principles, the new values or principles, one by one. I explained what they meant to me, how I interpreted them. And then I shared case studies. Maybe that word's a strong word. I shared examples I'd come across in other companies where they had used that exact value or where they had brought it to life in other companies or other countries. So the whole point was to share with them my perspective on it. And I think when people go through values workshops or values training, I think they go through 3 phases. And I told them, you're going to go through 3 phases with me. So here I babble on from 9 to 9:30, let's say. I have that half hour. At 9:30, I said, guys, you're going to go through 3 phases. Can I tell you what the 3 phases are? You ready? Here we go. Phase 1, I want you to intellectually understand these values. Well, good news. That's what I just did. I rattled on for 30 minutes so you could intellectually understand them because you have to know what they are. Phase 2 is come to believe in those values. But here's what's interesting, Gabe. This is very personal. People come to their own belief in their own way and in their own time. So of course, as a facilitator, I want to help inspire, I want to help persuade, I want to help influence, but I can't make anybody believe anything. That's not my job. I'm not a dime store Svengali that can stand on the soapbox and hypnotize you and say, you're going to believe all this by the end. I think that's talking down to people when you do that. So I was really clear that some of you are going to believe some of these values straight away. I can see in your eyes. Others of you are going to want to think about it. But don't worry. In the time in the rest of this session, when I'm not the one babbling at you, you're going to have a chance to explore these things. And Gabe, there's a sentence I wrote down I thought was really relevant here. If you want long-lasting behavioral change, you have to help people find it within themselves. You can't mandate it. You can't Svengali it. You have to help people find it within themselves. That's the belief stage. And then the third stage, and obviously the one that companies want, is they want people to act on those values, to behave or act in a way that's congruent with those particular values. So belief becomes kind of an engine for the action. So if I had to sum this all up, here's how I'd sum it up. I'd say, you understand, you believe, you act. And if we can harness those 3 phases at the individual level and get groups of individuals to go on that journey, that's where your organizational change is going to come from. So what do you think? I mean, I'm curious what you would like us to think about that.
I'm curious too. Make sure to get your questions into Daniel. We'll make sure we get to as many as we can. I love that, Daniel, because I think, regardless of the people who are listening right now are facilitating workshops.
Yeah.
They are trying to facilitate change, and they're trying to manage change and influence others, even when those others may not be accountable to them for the results. That's a big part of the role of the CX Pro, right? Yeah. So, I think what you're saying, is very relevant, regardless of if it's a workshop that you're tackling or not. So, I know you do so many workshops. You touch on every aspect of customer experience management and various customer touch points, from contact centers to deep dives into the CX discipline. And, from doing 60 of these things, I mean, what struck me when I heard you say that requires so much passion and commitment to stay fresh and to stay engaged and energized. So you must have had, some favorite things that, kept you motivated. What was your inspiration as you went through this?
Well, I mean, the first off is, thank goodness it wasn't a training. You really have to look at it as facilitation. And I think the second thing is, when you break those chains, that you have to make people believe in things, because that's a no-win proposition. People come to these beliefs in their own time. Let me share with you the one aspect. I like the entire workshop. It had a lovely flow. I'm happy to share it or write an article if people are curious about what went into a one-day workshop. But there was one piece that really, really worked, and let me explain that piece. We let people openly share what would hold them back. That's exactly how I said it. What's going to hold you back? We called it the barriers. So let me set the stage for how we did this. So imagine you're in a big, lovely corporate training room or meeting room, and out on the floor you see 30 people. Well, 30 people is basically 5 groups of 6 or 6 groups of 5. So imagine in your mind's eye you're looking out and you see 5 groups, and you see 5 or 6 people sitting at each table. Now each table will be comprised of different functions. So in a frontline session you might have 2 call center people, 2 retail people, a social media person, and so on. In a backline session, you might have 2 marketing people, a lawyer, a procurement person, and an engineer. That's what I actually loved, was seeing all the different functions all sitting together. So what I asked them to do, and they had an hour to do it, was just talk to each other. I'd like you to go one by one around your table, and I'd like you to talk about your job, yourself, and please share what's going to hold you back. Now, we went through 3 or 4 different values. So I said, if you want to go through each value and explain, I might get held back on this particular value or that particular value, please feel free. You can please be as specific as possible, but literally go around each one of you and share what's going to hold you back to everybody else. So that's all they did, was talk for an hour. I got to walk around and say hi and kneel down and say how you do, and that's it. There's no training here. And after about an hour, then I said, okay, guys, I can sense we've reached a point in the conversation where you've all gone around and talked to each other. Here's what I'd like you to do. You'll notice you all have flip charts at your tables. I'd like you to now transfer all those barriers onto a flip chart. So if there's 5 different functions at the table, Cindy, you're in engineering. Cindy, you write down the barriers you talked about in engineering. And Albert, you're in procurement. You write down the barriers for procurement. So they spent a few minutes writing it all down, and then you can predict or guess what happened next. And it was my favorite part. Every table presented to the whole group. I just got to sit on a big table and swing my legs and listen. It was pure facilitation. Yeah. Because they would stand up one by one and say, well, here are the barriers. I work in number 1626. We handle the hotline inquiries on blah, blah. And here are the issues that we're facing. Anyone in the room could ask questions. They could comment. They could clarify. They could say, yeah, I face that too. I mean, it was pure bonding and discussion across all the folks. And we just literally went around and let that happen. Sometimes it took an hour, sometimes it took 2 hours. So you're literally talking about a 1, 2, 3 hour exercise. I will say the fact I came from outside was probably a big help. I wasn't an employee of the company, so I had no political stake in the things that they had to say. It was a safe room. By the way, it actually felt like therapy at times, because people would cry, people would raise their voice, that you could see the care and the passion that came out in the people. And Gabe, I think what's important to clarify, and I did have to clarify this a couple times in the sessions, we're not here to solve the problem. If you raise up a barrier, we're not necessarily going to solve that barrier, but at least we're going to give that barrier airtime. We're going to honor that barrier. We're going to put it down. And another thing I'd like to say about these barriers, they were allowed to share any barriers. So let me start with the personal ones. A personal barrier is, I think that value is stupid. That's a personal barrier. Why would a company pick that? That's dumb. Another barrier would be what I call an ecosystem barrier. I like the value, but there's no way that's going to work in our company because we don't operate that way, or our departments don't work together that way. Can I tell you another ecosystem barrier that popped up? It rears its ugly head in every company. My boss is never going to go for this. My boss is never going to go for this. Of course, that popped up now and then. But we didn't exclude any barriers. You were allowed to openly talk about whatever it was you felt. So again, it was a very, very interesting process.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what did you do with the barriers? You know, you're compiling all this information. What did you do with it, and what expectation did you set with your participants around what you were going to do with it?
Well, first off, we were always very transparent. There were no hidden doors here. There was no Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain stuff. It was all, look, guys, let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take all your barriers I'm going to take them home tonight after you all go. I'm going to rip them off. That's why I always ask them to try and write in their best handwriting. And I created what we call a barriers report. And within 24 hours, I would have sent to my direct client contact, here's the barriers report for July 14th from the frontline group that was there. And I did kind of in a thematic research way. Here were the barriers raised by departments, the top one, the second one, the third one. Here were all the qualitative comments. Now, Gabe, obviously when I was facilitating, I was digging for the kinds of things I knew management would want to know. So if someone said, my barrier is X, and that's all they said, then a person like me might say, can you explain that a little bit more? A bit, CX therapy stuff. And then I got enough information and I would send the barriers report. And then to close out that thought, every 4 months or so, I got invited into the client, to the senior management team, and I would formally present the barriers from the front line, but I would aggregate all the frontline sessions we had done at that point. So whether that was 15, whether that was 35, whether that was 42, we literally had a master list of all the barriers from the front line, a master list similarly to all the backline, and we would present and go through the frontline ones. And I bet you can imagine the senior management team, as a few of them would flash up on the screen, they'd be like, yeah, we kind of expected that one. And then I flash the next one, they go, really? I'm just like, but this, so I think what was so interesting is that opportunity, and that's what I told the folks in the session is, whether you like it or not, I'm going to be your spokesperson. I'm like your UN leader. Remember in high school, they have the UN leader or whatever?
Yeah.
Cover everything and take it in and represent you. And here's the other thing that was self-fulfilling about doing this. After we had that first big aggregated barriers meeting with the senior management, they went and fixed a couple things straight away. And so I was able in the next session to say, not only are we all going to go through this process together, let me tell you what was fixed because of your colleagues in the session that came 6 months ago. And they were like, oh yeah, we noticed that they changed this or that. I said, yeah, but that was because of you. So classic VOE stuff, Gabe. That's
phenomenal. What a great way to drive their, what a great way to drive their interest and engagement, right? To know that you are about to step into a session that is going to potentially lead to some meaningful changes to improve your work and to improve the customer's experience at that touch point.
Yeah. And to really say that, they want to hear what we have to say, good, bad, or ugly. There was no whitewashing it. Obviously, I said to them, this is part of my job. If you stand here and tell me you don't like your boss, there's not much I can do with that because they're going to look at me and say, why doesn't she like me? And they all started laughing. So I said, if you want that to be your barrier, you're going to have to tell me specifically why you don't like your boss. So later on, when I'm presenting in the big CEO, I'll say, they don't like you because you're very much like this. And then they all started laughing. So I said, you're welcome to raise barriers, but please put some content or context behind it because we can all criticize, but you have to kind of explain what's making you uncomfortable a little bit, right?
Yeah, that's so fantastic, and I imagine so gratifying that over that 2-year period, you're probably seeing the barriers change, and that has to be so cool.
Now, I have to admit, I don't get involved. I recognize all this Agile methodology and all that. I think it's all really cool. I don't specifically get involved in that with myself. But this particular workshop was just one of a number of pillars that they were rolling out. So while we were doing these kinds of workshops, they were also out there doing all these kinds of Agile projects, improvement, continuous improvement, tightening up their VOC processes. So everything was kind of engineered out by a small team of about 4 people. 4 people in the company. It sounds like a classic CX team, doesn't it, Gabe?
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
And one of them was responsible for me, but she actually said, oh, you're easy. It's all this other stuff that's hard. You just go do you go make them laugh and cry, and we'll take care of the rest. So.
Yeah. So Daniel Gulam asked a question. I think it's a good one. Is management okay with only barriers, or would they also want to hear the good stuff as well?
I think the point here was management, and I like the question, Gulam. The point is, guys, we're going through change. These are the behaviors that we think are important. We really want to see you act on these behaviors. So if you're going to act on these behaviors, that's great. We don't need to spend a lot of airtime on that, or you can do that with your bosses. You don't need to do that in the context of a cultural workshop. But when Dan's here, maybe we can share with Dan what's going to hold us back, because that's the stuff we have to lift the rock and look at and fix. So it's not that we were ignoring the good. As a matter of fact, in a moment, I'll share with you some of the really surprisingly good stuff that popped out. But this was really about, okay, the company has put this on the screen. They've said these are the values we want to adhere to and believe in. So please tell us now. Sometimes I would be silly and say, speak now or forever hold your peace. I mean, you can tell already we get a little bit silly, but you have to. That's why it never gets boring, by the way.
Yeah.
So Ghulam, I hope that answers the question. It's not that we were ignoring the good, it's that our job was to uncover the barriers. So
yeah, fantastic. Getting some love in comments. Tatiana says, very insightful, taking notes as you speak. Awesome. Glad this is valuable, Tatiana, and glad that you're joining us. So, Daniel, I know that, as I said, there's others here who are trying to figure out, how do I ensure that my organizational values or our customer promises or whatever they are embedded in our hiring and our onboarding and our ongoing training. So what advice would you share to others who are, who are fighting this important battle, doing this important work to turn the wheel and shift the culture in their organization?
Yeah, Gabe. And I think the first thing is, and again, I'm not saying anything that many of you haven't heard or don't know, but sometimes we have to hear the basics again. You have to first off look at this for the long haul. We're not talking about 6 months or a year. I mean, this particular organization invested 2 years. By the way, one thing I didn't mention at the beginning is they ran a whole nother set of workshops for the same people. And I was asked to do it or consider doing it. And at that point, I was shifting from Asia to Europe, which is why I didn't actually take on that particular engagement. So I want to point out that they had another round of 2 years. They're talking about 4 or 5 years worth of workshops. So they were kind of following up on all that particular stuff. So the time frame matters. The other thing is, and again, I'm telling you things that you already know, but you embed this in the hiring process. So I think when you're doing hiring of anybody, you're using behavioral interview questions. You're asking, can you share with me an example of how you used ownership in your own career? Now you can say that to an engineer or you can say that to an email writing team member. So I think the hiring part, the hiring thing I've always heard and found very useful is we got to get the right people on the bus. We got to get the wrong people off the bus, and we have to make sure the bus is moving in the right direction. And I have seen clients over the years going through different kinds of transformations, which were very clear that we need to get better about who we hire, and we have to recognize that not everybody is going to make it. Now, some people get a little bit frustrated when they hear me say that, but that's just the reality. There will be some group of people who will say, no, I don't like these values. I mean, I worked for a global courier company for many years, doing training and that kind of thing. They were super high paced and super on time. As you can imagine, their whole business promise was being on time. Not everybody could take that. So there were some people that would join that and say, this fits with who I am. Their values align with my internal values. I like it here. Whereas someone else will say, oh man, their values are so contradictory to my own. It's not a good, bad thing. It's just that it didn't fit. So I'm not going to work here. So the hiring, it's funny. I was just having a conversation with a colleague this morning about rituals. I'm a huge fan of rituals, which is those regular daily or weekly or monthly events where you highlight some aspect of customer service. I think one of the examples that we talk about is a software team that has a funeral for an old version of software when they retire it. And they all put on black and burn candles and have a eulogy for version 2.x13. But that's a ritual to say you've met the customer's needs up to this point. We love you, have a rest in peace, and move on. I mean, the classic one is the Ritz-Carlton. They all get together 15 minutes every morning, et cetera, et cetera. So I think embedding these kinds of rituals also has a big part to play.
Yeah, great thought. And there's a question that came in that I think is a good one. Pratik asks, how do you help prioritize these action items? Is that something that you helped, as you're taking these barriers back, is that something that you helped with, or were they doing that internally?
I have helped with other clients when it came to financial aspects, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm an accountant or former accountant, so I'm good at doing the financial prioritization. For this client, I wasn't asked to do it, but I was there in the room when they had some of these discussions. I will say this, and I hope it helps. The first thing is, please pick the low-hanging fruit straight away. So they teach you, if you're doing an employee survey and employees say, well, we need you to re-engineer this and re-engineer that. Oh, and by the way, we all hate lima beans in the cafeteria, so can you get rid of lima beans? For heaven's sakes, go get rid of the lima beans, because sometimes people just need to see some kind of action happening. So go first for those low-hanging fruit, and then be really transparent with people about what's on the table, what's going to take a bit more time, what's going to take a bit less time. I come from the contact center industry, and here's something I would say to the frontline team members. I'd say, guys, we're getting tons of calls. They're pouring in. I know you're all dying. I can see it. Some of you haven't had a haircut in 20 years or 20 days or whatever, blah, 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 blah. But look, my job as your boss in this case is to let you know there's light at the end of the tunnel. I think people can put up with an awful lot and go through an awful lot if they see light at the end of the tunnel. I think, and again, I'm taking this a lot from my experience in customer service and contact centers. I think when you start not to see light at the end of the tunnel, when you turn to your colleagues and say, is anything ever going to change here? Are they ever going to bring in more staff? Are we always going to be buried in calls? Is our equipment always going to be failing all the time? That's when people turn to each other and say, you know, it's just not worth it. It's time to go. So I do think this light at the end of the tunnel thing matters. Low-hanging fruit, light at the end of the tunnel, be as transparent with people as you can. But I think that selection of exactly which items, that's going to be very dependent on the kind of business you are, the kind of resources you have, where you're going. But I will say this, and I'll close out the thought with this, Gabe. If you have selected these 3 things to be your values, or these 4 things to be your values, and you're telling everyone else these are important for you to behave in, then I, as the CEO and senior leadership team, also have to prove that I take them seriously too. So I think that's the key, is to show that you take it as seriously as you're asking other people to take it seriously. So
absolutely, totally agree with you on that. Ghulam asked another great question I want to bring in, because talking about barriers. Are there barriers that the participants themselves can address, or is everything up to management only? So to what extent is there sort of this empowerment to drive?
Well, it's a really good question, Ghulam, and let me give you a very specific example. Here's a barrier that actually came up with the frontline people. They said, Dan, you know, this may sound funny, but you want us to show all these cool things. But God, customers are so nasty these days. I've been doing customer service for 10 years, and we talked about this in the session. Customers today are much more demanding. Now, I'm being polite. We didn't always use the word demanding. But for our CXPA webinar, I'm pulling out the polite language here. And so here, it wasn't really so much what can management do to make customers less nasty. Really, the discussion ended up being, how can we look in the mirror and deal with these things a little bit better? In the beginning of the session, I said that the frontline workshop and the backline workshop were 80% the same. Can I tell you what the 20% difference was? In the frontline workshop, we put in some customer service skills, but we put in some pretty advanced skills around empathy and dealing with difficult customers. So in this case, the management had already identified the solution and said, Dan, we know this is going to come up. Why don't we spend an hour or an hour and a half on some advanced customer service? And that was super, super popular. So Ghulam, you're right to say not every barrier had to do with management fixing it. Sometimes it was as simple as, why don't you get up out of your desk and go visit the girl in the other department or the guy in the other department and talk to them? Can I give you one more barrier that popped up that they solved? After the session, and it was across every group, honestly, it wasn't just one group, we don't want to use email anymore. Now that we've met each other, and we know that we're not monsters and we like each other and we all work for the same company, instead of this constant emailing, why don't I just pick up the phone and call Tony over in IT? Why don't I just pick up the phone and call Roberta over in finance? So they actually, as a group, said, we're sick of email, but instead of blaming our bosses for email, we ourselves are going to change our own email behaviors. I said, oh, wouldn't that be great? So anyway, I thought that was an interesting point.
That's really great, Daniel. We're getting so many great questions that are coming in right now.
Oh dear. Okay.
So many questions. This is such a great discussion. Patty asked, what measures and metrics go in place to measure success for you? There are many that could be used, and I was wondering what you prioritized, in context of this engagement.
Sure, sure. Obviously, there was a post-workshop evaluation that was done immediately. So that was tabulated within an hour, the scores, the feedback, and all there. So that would be the first. I think that's Kirkpatrick level 1, the reaction phase of training, if I can remember forgive me, yeah. And then it was the longer term feedback that, yeah, Dan, you did give us good barriers to work on. We can tell that the data or information you gathered in the sessions sounded real to us. You were definitely cluing into real problems, because the concern was if the trainer sits there and just transcribes a bunch of flip charts, they could hand over to the management team a bunch of nonsense. And then the management team is like, what are we supposed to do with this? But they actually fed back and said, the barriers that you gave to us were very clearly laid out, had a lot of detail that you obviously dug out of the participants, and that allowed us to approach the solutions more clearly. So there was some short-term instant feedback, like the testimonials and the scores and so on. And then there was the longer term from the client saying, yes, and our people are going back. The managers are telling us their people are excited. By the way, managers had to attend the session too. This wasn't purely for rank and quote unquote rank and file. Every single employee in the company had to go through this. So only the CEO was exempt. Everybody else turned up. So.
Wow, that's fantastic. Taking a look at some of the other questions here. Oh boy, this is a big one, Daniel, and I don't know how much time we have.
Oh my gosh.
Can you share some insight on how to integrate CX seamlessly through all the departments and branches of a company? I mean, obviously we're talking about culture, and I love the CXPA competency framework and knowledge domains, because it gets at this. There's culture, and then there's this organizational adoption and accountability, which so closely related. So, wondering if you have any insight to share there.
Well, yes. And I think there's one word I'm going to say, and again, it might be a little bit controversial. Obviously, values are important. That's what this whole discussion is all about. And you can see how much people like Gabe and I and all of you respect values and know how important they are. And that understand, believe, act model really works. Metrics, metrics, metrics. If you're telling people these are the behaviors that you want them to follow, they can't be behaviors that contradict the metrics that they're measured on. And this is a tired example. I'm the first to admit even I'm tired of it. But if you're telling your customer service people, spend time with the customer to solve their problem, make sure you probe deeply and analyze and get to it. Oh, and by the way, and show all empathy. But make sure your average handling time is only 3 minutes. Well, clearly your metric stands directly in the way of one of the values. So I will say not a lot of the barriers, but there were a few barriers that came up that were, Dan, the values make a lot of sense. The way you present them makes a lot of sense, but my metrics don't support that. So I totally think looking at the metrics that you're measured on within your department or within your function. So for example, their engineering department shared with us some of their metrics. But the metrics they had in their engineering department, some of them didn't really work in this new values construct. Now that's not a fatal flaw. I think this is part of an evolution. This is part of going back and saying, I've learned that these are the 3 or 4 values I'm supposed to bring to life. Maybe we need to relook at our average handling time, or maybe we need to look at our turnaround time. There was even discussion across all groups that maybe they could implement some internal service level agreements with each other. So when would engineering get back to a customer service person? When would marketing get back to a product development person, and so on? So they were actually talking about how could they work better together. But again, the metrics have to support all that. Gabe, I don't know if that answers, but I come back to metrics.
It's fascinating to me that that these workshops, really advanced this evolution in a close examination of really not just culture, but all aspects of the business in support of that desired culture. That's really cool.
There's something I didn't mention, but I'll mention it now on Backline people in particular, because clearly you can tell from my profile and the bio and all that boring bit, I come a lot from customer service contact center. But something you learn about Backline people is they have tremendous pride in what they do. And there's actually cultural research that seems to show that a quote unquote Backline person, let's say an accountant, has more attachment to their profession than they do to their company. Now, as a former accountant, that resonates with me. I'm more proud of being an engineer than I am working for ABC. I'm more proud of being a lawyer than I am working for ABC company. So I think what we had to learn to do with the Backline people was honor that pride in their profession. You don't sit there and say, you guys don't support customer service enough. That's going to backfire. We had to somehow overlay the values on top of that Backline pride. I don't know how else to put it, but it was very interesting to work with group after group after group of what I call professionals, because obviously to be an IT person, a lawyer, a marketing person, a regulatory professional, that requires a certain background or certain years of experience. So that was, I think that's the question. Yeah.
That's a really fascinating insight, Daniel. I've not heard that before, but I think that's a potential aha and instrumental for those trying to drive change, is, appealing to that sense of professional pride, or trying to uncover, what that lever is.
Yeah,
Very cool.
that's the word. That's the word, Gabe. The lever. Which levers do we kind of pull? That's exactly the same analogy I use. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Jerry asked a really great question here. Were there any discussions that were off limits or out of scope, and how did you set
It's a really good
ground
question,
rules?
Jerry. We didn't set boundaries. I will say there were probably 2 times. If I said 0, I'm obviously not telling the truth. There were 2 times where one of the participants wouldn't let go of how terrible their boss was. They really seemed to either be having a really bad day. Again, you never know what's going on fully in someone's life. So I do remember taking her to the side and basically saying, I think you're having a really bad day. And I'm yeah, because really, and so I said to her, look, you're welcome to stay. At the same time, we have a certain set of objectives. Would you like to reschedule yourself for a future session? Because that was the beauty of having this lengthy calendar. And she actually checked herself out. Now, it could have been her child was ill. It could have been, we all know things happen in our lives. Maybe she didn't have breakfast. If I don't have breakfast, I'm a dinosaur, forget it. So that was one. And the 2 times or 3 times it happened, it was always about the boss. My boss is never going to get it. And it would be like this. You all know my boss, don't you? I mean, they were trying to pull the negative spotlight. So I admit that's where facilitation comes in. It's like, that's not going to take us very far.
Yeah. Dan, one other question that I have, and been thinking about this one, we know culture is so important. And there are so many new and ongoing business pressures that CX professionals face. How can we keep that culture and accountability arrow pointing up when, the point of this discussion today was, we're not talking ROI specifically, but that's something that's so critical to all of us is, what is the ROI? How can I tie, my CX metrics to my business KPIs? So in this discussion about culture, I think it can be seen as a kind of a squishy thing. Yeah. So how can we keep the culture arrow going up?
Okay, I think that's a great question. Here we go. I'm gonna move away from these workshops and talk about doing some judging for some CX Leader of the Year awards and share that. I think that is the answer here. I saw quite a few awards entries from CX Leader of the Year entries. Doesn't matter who was running the awards, that's irrelevant. And basically they said, we went around and we identified that these 3 behaviors or these 3 values were the ones that had the most impact on the customer. So obviously we selected those as our values. But we did more than that. We made them part of our metrics. So if we felt that showing respect was an important value, our survey asked the question, by the way, I'm not writing survey questions here, so don't I'm not wordsmithing here, but right. Did you feel respected by the person at the customer service department? If you felt being accurate was one of your most important values, or taking ownership of a problem was one of your most important values, that was actually included in the survey results. So when I saw entry after entry after entry, and this is the cream of the crop of CX leaders from all over the world, I was like, this is incredible, because they're not just coming up with culture as the squishy thing you're talking about with the pictures on the wall. They're now implementing it in their transactional and their relationship survey processes and actually putting numbers behind it. And I presume, without going too far down this path, that when they're doing their journey mapping and all that stuff, that's the lens they're using. They're looking, to me, all these values are lenses. So when I look at the journey, Where are we showing respect? Where are we showing ownership? Where are we showing accuracy? I think that's where the rubber meets the road. Because you're 100% right. You got to take those things off the wall, and you actually got to put them into the practice. So I thought the VOC work and the journey mapping work, which is part of VOC, was a brilliant way to do it.
That's fantastic. Daniel, this has been a fantastic discussion. Love all the questions and engagement that we've gotten in the comments. Thank you to all of you. Daniel, you are such a passionate advocate for CX and for creating a customer-centric culture. And also, the work that you have done to advance the cause of CX globally. Just wanted to make sure that folks know that you can learn more about Daniel and his work at his website, omnitouchinternational.com. And additionally, I don't think I mentioned that Daniel is a recognized training provider. CXPA recognized training provider, providing quality CX training along with several others. So if you are interested in learning more about our recognized trainers, check us out there at cxpa.org/recognized trainers. So we also hope that you're going to join us back here next week, where we're going to welcome Bruno Guimarães, the leader of CXPA's Brazil network. He's going to talk about the growth of CX discipline in that country. So Daniel, thank you. It's been a pleasure having you on live with CXPA.
Thank you very much. Is it over already? No, I'm just kidding. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there'll be more questions that are coming into the comments that maybe we can pick up after. But until then, to everybody who tuned in, hope you stay safe and have a great week. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.